Good evening. Good evening. On behalf of the 22nd Annual UTM Civil Rights Conference chairs, Dr. Lindsay Anderson, Henrietta Giles, and myself, Anthony Pruitt, we want to welcome you all and thank you all for coming out and joining us tonight. We have something very special for you all. And I'm going to allow our Dean of our library, Dr. Eric Norberg, to introduce our speaker tonight. But we're super excited because there is a lot of things that we discovered during this conference. And it builds upon our knowledge base and gives us a lot of context to a lot of things that have occurred. And tonight we're going to be talking about Freedom Libraries, the untold story of libraries for African Americans in the South. And we have a dynamic speaker, Mr. Mike Selby. Dr. Nordberg, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our speaker.
Great, thanks, Anthony, and hello, Henrietta. It's a pleasure for the library to be involved with the Civil Rights Conference this year. For those that are on campus and can visit, we have an exhibit right now in our special collections area, which is a collection of photographs that were taken during Freedom Summer 1964 in the town of Somerville in Fayette County in West Tennessee, that showed a group of students from Cornell University who came down to help with voter registration. That exhibit is open in the library during the weekdays, but happy to find ways to get people in to do that. As a librarian and a historian, I'm always fascinated by the ways that stories play out both in real life, but how they kind of manifest themselves in historical records. I'm an archivist by training, so not surprisingly, I've always been kind of interested to see how that works. It's my pleasure tonight to have a real dynamic speaker. I've heard Mike Selby speak before. This is a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, it's a part of the story of the Freedom Summers that I think most people don't understand or have never heard of. And one of the things that Mike's done with this work is he's really expanded out from some of the very simple stories that people have tacked on to the Freedom Summer kind of story and really dived in a bit deeper. You may not realize it, but Mike is a librarian in Cranbrook, British Columbia. So he's actually zooming in to us from north of the border. He's also using the Children's Librarian's Office. So you might notice a few puppets behind him, but that's all part of the mystique that he brings to the table when we hear him speak. I had the pleasure of hearing him speak to the Library History Roundtable with the American Library Association last year, and just knew that it would be a great connection to what we're doing with the Civil Rights Conference. Even though he's in British Columbia, the reason that he kind of found this story is that he did his library science master's degree at the University of Alabama. And that was kind of where he found this story and has been running with it for several years now. This is not only an interesting read, but was also selected by the Association of College and Research Libraries as their 2020 academic book of the year. So it has also gained a lot of notoriety. And with that, I'll shut up for a little while and let's actually hear the presenter that we wanted to bring here. I'll turn things over to you, Mike, and thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Norberg. Hello, I'm Mike Selby. As that introduction said, I'm here to share some slides with you and talk to you about Freedom Libraries, which took place during Freedom Summer, which I'll get into. I'll just share my slides here with everybody. And can everyone see that and hear me?
Not quite yet.
Okay.
Oh, you know what? It's because I'm one of the panelist people, I'm guessing. Is that correct, Anthony?
Yeah, we can hear
Great.
you.
I'll be quiet.
Okay, so Freedom Libraries, the untold story of libraries for African Americans in the South. A book I wrote 2 years ago, and I'll tell you the story. So the American Public Library movement starts in Boston October 18th in 1852, that's when the city of Boston passed document 37. It was the first document of its kind that said it would use public funds, taxes, to fund a library. And people who paid property taxes would have access to the library. And that model was used all across North America to start a public library movement. Andrew Carnegie was the next chapter in public libraries, sort of the Bill Gates of his time, a steel magnate who in today's money would have billions and billions, and he gave it all away. And one thing he did is he built libraries. He would build libraries if the town would commit to finding the property, the land. He would build the building, and then the city would be responsible. And there are thousands and thousands of Carnegie libraries around the world, especially the United States and Canada.
Mike, I'm sorry, I'm gonna interrupt
Yeah,
you
your
here
slides.
because
Oh,
I
sorry.
don't think we're seeing the slides.
Oh, no.
You may have to do new share.
Okay.
Since you previewed them earlier, you may have to do new share and just start it again.
Is that working?
No.
Not yet.
Any suggestions, Andrew?
I mean, it should be as simple as clicking at the bottom, clicking share screen, and then you can click PowerPoint. It's one of your options.
There we go.
Now, perfect.
Thanks, Mike. Sorry about that.
My fault, sorry.
Oh, it's so much better with slides.
I apologize to everyone for the technical difficulties, but thanks for sticking with us. Here we're with Andrew Carnegie. As I explained, he used his wealth to build libraries, and you can still see his name on many libraries in North America, and they were supposed to be free and for all. He wasn't allowed in library and growing up. You had to pay $2 to use it, and he couldn't afford it. So this was the driving thing, and he made them free for all. And in the United States, Carnegie libraries were free for all, unless you were Black. You can see here, an African-American woman is being ejected from a Carnegie library in Albany. It has a free for all plaque. You can't see it in the photo, but it had on the door. But even though African-Americans paid taxes to fund this library, they were segregated and not allowed to use it. Here we are in Georgia. This young person's trying to work on a homework assignment. He's not allowed in there either because he's African-American. You can see we have a city police, state police, regular law enforcement, and an FBI man who was called in to deal with whatever disruption this poor young man was doing. Here we have the Birmingham Public Library in Alabama. This is a Miles College student who needed a book. He's trying to get a library card here. You can see they have just about all the staff telling him he's not eligible. He was later told it was because Negroes stink, and that's why they weren't allowed into the library. Those are the nice ones. Here's one in Texas, another mother being forcibly removed from trying to use a public library. Louisiana as well. This was common seen across the southern United States. Not so much in the north, but segregation was practiced there too. All this came to a head during the Civil Rights Movement. Two people shown here, the one leaning on the door is Bob Moses. He's talking with Amzie Moore in Greenwood, Mississippi. And this was right in the spring of 1964. They're trying to get a voter registration drive because if anyone knows American history, blacks were kept off the voter polls through various horrible means, a literacy test that nobody would be able to pass, let alone people who were denied schooling and library service. So Bob Moses' suggestion was we'll get a small army here in Greenwood and we'll go out throughout the state of Mississippi in the summer. And that was sort of the birth of Freedom Summer. But Amzie Moore said, instead of a small army from within, we should get a large army from without. And this was the birth of Freedom Summer, where about 1,000 students, most of them white, would come into the southern states in the summer of 1964. And they would help people with voter registration, and they would build libraries. One of the group responsible was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Here we have Julian Bond is in the front. He later became a legislator. And they're getting ready here at Oxford, Ohio Women's College, which is now called Miami University. But this was a place where they could, for a couple of weeks, train volunteers, tell them what they need to do, and send them into the southern states. So after 2 weeks, they got ready, they sung songs, get ready to board buses to go into the South. People didn't have buses, they had their own. I love this picture. It's such a 60s photo with the Volkswagen. And they're packing up, getting ready to leave. And it was scary. Lots of them were terrified. They knew it was still the United States, but Emmett Till's, the photo, if everyone's familiar with Emmett Till, his mother with the photo, had been released right before that in Look magazine. And that was on every parent's mind and handed down to the young college kids. So they were terrified. And this was what was waiting for. Local law enforcement looks here, they're about to, with their guns, stop a riot instead of the college kids coming to help people learn literacy. But this is what greeted them, just for intimidation purposes. Here's another photo. It may look like a law enforcement person, but that's just security for a Ku Klux Klan in the city. This is Macomb, Mississippi. And it's just to intimidate the college students that were coming down. They would parade up and down where the Freedom Summer, where the volunteers were living or working or setting up libraries. So everything they could to intimidate these people to go back to Moscow was a favorite thing they like to say to them. But it didn't work. The hundreds of thousands of books poured in so people could set up freedom libraries. Now, because there was no public libraries available, these libraries during Freedom Summer would be critical. For a lot of African Americans, it would be the first experience they would have with books and a library. This is in Ruleville, Mississippi. This is a Freedom Library that was set up. You can see most of them are just rented shacks or old homes or abandoned buildings, anywhere where they could put these books, and you can see what they're typing a card catalog there, the volunteers. In Gold, Arkansas, this is the Freedom Library that was set up there. They were charged $8,000 a month for this empty shack because people did not want them there. But they found the funds, they paid, this thing was decrepit, but it really helped. This is what it looked like inside. People have been denied library service, which had to be one of the cruelest aspects of Jim Crow. Could finally come in and read and help and do what people do in libraries today. Here's one they had to borrow pews from a local church. And this is a scene you could see in libraries all over the South during Freedom Summer. People meeting, people talking, having discussions. The literacy test was a big one for voting, and so they coached a lot of adults on how to write the literacy test. Even if they got it right, they would probably be failed by the registrars, but the federal government was watching what was happening because of Freedom Summer. Violence was rained on African Americans the whole time in the South, but 1,000, white kids, their fathers are mayors and politicians, and there was a lot of press on that. And it really revealed what was happening during this time. Here's two kids. They started a newspaper, the Freedom Press, and they would interview people and type it up and pass it around. Life skills were also taught at the Freedom Libraries. Here's some typing lessons going on, as well as some sewing. A lot of the women, a lot of the girls in the community would come, and we don't know how to make dresses. We would like to wear something newer. So they got a singer to donate some sewing machines. Voting rights was the big thing, so they could help people who were illiterate, who couldn't read, maybe could sign an X or their name. But because of their age, they knew a lot of things and they knew a lot of words, and it was just trying to get them so they could vote. The first contact with books, literacy, trying to register for voting was important. Probably the biggest legacy the Freedom Libraries brought was just basic human contact. Here's a woman that had no idea that she could be friends with white people. And these libraries, although they're only there for a summer, they really shattered a lot of people's worldviews. This is Stokely Carmichael, who went on to become quite a controversial leader, started the Black Panthers and Black Power thing. He visited every Freedom Library. There was 80 during Freedom Summer throughout the South. He showed up at most of them. He was a character. Kids were just drawn to him. And he thought the Freedom Libraries were probably the best thing going. Here's the Ku Klux Klan had burned a cross on one outside the Greenwood Freedom Library, so the kids turned it into a sign. Besides intimidation and cross burnings, violence was going to be ramped up. And they were bombed. Most of the Freedom Libraries had a person, were bombed, or were shot up. But as you can see here, they were destroyed, these ad hoc libraries that had been set up were bombed all over the place. And then volunteers were murdered. People might be familiar with an FBI case called Mississippi Burning, where Mickey Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney were murdered by the sheriff and the deputies. There's been a couple films made about it. But most people don't know Mickey Schwerner was down there with his wife setting up a Freedom Library. That's why he was in the South. Andrew Goodman had come also. He had met at Oxford, and James Chaney was a local volunteer. Mickey Schwerner loved Mississippi. He went to the high school, the basketball games. He hung out with the kids. The Freedom Library was really a center of the community. This is Father John Daniels at the Haynesville Freedom Library, which opened up in Alabama. He too, with another Catholic priest, was shot to death right outside the Freedom Library. Richard Morsel was the other priest who lived. People thought he was dead, but when an ambulance got there, he was alive. So there was a lot of violence, as you can see, bombings, death, but it didn't stop people. People kept rebuilding these libraries and kids, and teenagers, and adults kept coming. Now, as anyone who visits a public library today, it's not just books, but culture as well. So an organization called themselves the Free Southern Theater. Blew it up. They had actors and they would go around and put on plays at all the Freedom Libraries. Here's a photo of the Free Southern Theater getting ready. This is actress Denise Nicholas. She went on to become quite a famous actress. She was in a show called Room 22, if anyone's my age or older. And In the Heat of the Night, she won quite a few Emmys for being in that. A lot of movies in the 80s as well. She got her start here at the Free Southern Theater. She went on and ran a Freedom Library in Louisiana, but it was later, it was in 1966, and it didn't last long at all due to even then violence against her. She had a gun held to her head, telling her to stop having the library. But happier times here. Probably the best story is in Macomb, Mississippi. The Free Southern Theater was getting ready to put on Waiting for Godot, when the sheriff and the deputies and the state police, probably about 100 law enforcement, showed up. People didn't know, what was happening now, were to be arrested, because they were arrested all the time, the volunteers. But the sheriff asked if they could see a play, if they could see the play too, because none of them had seen live theater. So they made room. Everyone, the police got to watch the play. People that night didn't think there was any racial progress made that night, but who knows? It just shows the kind of poverty and world thinking that went on during this time. This was a young girl named Sandira Faye. She hung out at the Gold Freedom Library. One of the volunteers, a college student, was studying at the Sorbonne, and she came and she said, "I will give French lessons." And Sandira Faye went up one side of her and down the other, that there was no way she was learning French. Why should she have to learn French? There's no one speaks French in Mississippi. Our town doesn't even have an elevator or any shopping. This is just the biggest waste of time. And the volunteer sat her down and said, "Sandira, I want to teach you French, because one day you're going to go to France." This is Dr. Sandira Faye today, who was a literature professor at the University of Texas. She has been to France many, many times. You could see how the libraries shattered the fiction that many people were trapped at the time. Millard Lowe was another volunteer. He hung this photo up in the Freedom Library in, I think it was Greenwood, Mississippi, and asked kids to point, where's this bench that says whites only? And all the kids said, is it here? Is it Alabama? It has to be maybe Georgia. And he said, no, this is a photo of South Africa. It's not just us. Half the world is experiencing this trouble. We have to remember that no matter how much hatred is brought on you, we're all in this together. And he always had the kids chant, we're all in this together. This is a quote from a New York Times reporter, noticing the effect segregation had on people who tried to use public things, and the African Americans who were kept out. And it's in my book, starts with it, and I think it really sums up just the quest for dignity that these people had during Freedom Summer. The libraries didn't last. They were, like, many of them were destroyed. The students went back to university up north. Most of the Freedom Libraries were turned into the community centers or Head Starts, but they only lasted that brief summer. And if you've made it this far, I thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening. And I'm happy to answer any questions people have.
Mr. Selby, thank you so much for your presentation. If anybody is joining or watching us, if you want to use or submit a question, please utilize the Q&A tab down at the bottom, and then we will read those out and get Mr. Selby to answer. Mr. Selby, give us a couple of seconds.
Well, this is Eric. I can ask a question.
Go ahead.
And Mike, I know that I've seen in some of the other literature that's out there, and you mentioned this a little bit in passing, but maybe you could share a bit more about after the summer and the work that was done in the South. Did this influence some of the other activities elsewhere in the United States? Was this only a Southern activity, or did we see activity of freedom libraries in other places?
There's only one outside the South, and that was north in Philadelphia. And that was in 1966. Someone who had worked in the South at these freedom libraries had started it there. It did exactly the same. Books were donated. People came. Philadelphia had one of the worst riots, race riots in history, and the streets of downtown Philadelphia were destroyed, but the Freedom Library itself was passed over, which showed how much respect people had. And it was, I want to say Black Power, but that's not, it wasn't the ideology of the time, but it was strictly for African Americans. And I spoke with the gentleman who had started it, and he said, yes, it was for African Americans only, but a white person hadn't tried to use it or visit or anything. So he couldn't remember if they would be allowed to or not. But just in the neighborhood it was in, it did a lot of good, but it only lasted briefly. And it was turned into a Head Start education, which was Head Start at that location for 30 years. But that's the only one up north that I could find in my research. It's hard to find anything on freedom libraries, mainly because libraries themselves are sort of in the background, and so much else was happening during the civil rights movement. This was a blip, but I think a very important one. And the people who used them sure thought they were important.
So there are several questions in the Q&A box. I can read these to you as well, Mike, and you can respond to some of these. The first question is probably a shorter answer. Exactly how long were the freedom libraries available?
Just for Freedom Summer, the majority, so 3 or 4 months at the most. By September, they did not exist at all. The 2 in Alabama were set up in 1965. Again, Selma was shut down. One in Selma, Alabama only went for 2 months in the summer, and Haynesville was a month after the killings. And the family that ran it, their house was shot up, and the people they had 5 like really young kids. So they burned the Freedom Library on their own just to protect themselves.
Great. And then a couple of questions that kind of fit together. Did any of the freedom libraries survive? Do they still exist as buildings, whether they're libraries or not?
The one in Selma does. It's an insurance place. It was rented at the time, a post office, a postman. It was owned the building and he had rented it to them, and it's still there. But it's been various businesses and it's just insurance. But if you have my book, you'll see one of the volunteers there 50 years later revisiting it. But that is the only one that is still standing. The one in Haynesville, the family that was shut up, they still live in the same place. They had a shotgun shack, but they have a modern home now. But they showed me where the Freedom Library was before they burned it. So it's not there, but the site is still there. The rest, no. And it's too bad. Someone should have made a plaque or something of something. So much was happening. At the time, you don't know which way the civil rights unit was going to go. It seems to us all reading about it, but at the time, no one knew what the outcome would be.
I should point out that we do have a copy of your book in our library that I think it's checked out right now. Some clever person found it to read before this presentation, but if folks have an interest, they should be aware that there's a copy there. There's a couple of other questions here that go together. One of them is just, what can you tell us about when libraries eventually became integrated? Was this due to federal law, or did states take up this topic? And then connected to that, there was a question from one of the folks here in our group about whether that integration was challenging for the folks that were trying to work on it.
Yeah, so shortly after Freedom Summer, the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 1964. And in 1965, the voting rights was, I may have those dates reversed, but I think that's correct. One's in 64, one's in 65. It was, at the time in the South, it wasn't legal to segregate libraries. It was just tradition. And they found all kinds of ways to do it because everyone was guaranteed through the amendments of your Constitution. But by then, that's when segregation really ended. Some cities did it quietly, gladly. Some didn't. I know in Alabama, they would, okay, we have to let African Americans in, so they removed the furniture. So everyone had to stand. No one would stay for very long. Or, they would do sneaky things like that, but they were on the wrong side of history. And by the end of the 60s, all libraries in the United States, from my research, had been desegregated. I don't know which the last one to desegregate was. I don't know if anyone knows.
And then you had mentioned a little bit about South Africa. What other stories might you have found while you were working on this about this concept of freedom libraries appearing when there's a need because of segregation?
Yeah, and it's difficult to compare the United States because South Africa had they had apartheid and the same kind of oppression in the 90s when apartheid was done with and public libraries were available for everyone of every color. Even up to today, they've been burned and arsoned, not by whites, but by the Black people protesting against the government. They see a public library, it's part of the government. They remember what the government did in the past, or they're not paving the roads or providing clean water. The libraries are the first to go. So it doesn't compare. They didn't have any sort of freedom libraries. They'd have segregated libraries there. I have a story in my book of one young man going into a Johannesburg segregated, but they got a shipment of African-American authors. And he pulled down, I think it's Richard Wright. And what he read just changed his life because it put, as most of us will find in libraries or in literacy, it put into words his feelings that he didn't know how to say or how to get out. I talked about oppression and the color line. And he said, this is my life. And he was so thankful to have these books that he had access to them. He moved away out of South Africa and never went back. But that's the power that libraries and literacy have. And when you're denied it, and then when you can find it, it's really something. It sure makes me, who I've had libraries in every school I went to had a library, and I've been any city I've visited in different parts of the world, I've been able to go into a library. And just to think that people weren't allowed in, or violence would be rained on you if you tried to use it, is really it's shocking. I hope there's a second part of your question. I don't know if I answered it.
No, I think you got that. I think Henrietta had a question as well.
Thank you, Mike, for your presentation. Very enlightening. One point I'd like to make, my family hosted some of the workers who had come from the North in the 1960s during Freedom Summer to help teach literacy skills to prepare people to vote. So this is all very interesting. And I'm wondering, now you have my wheels turning, to look and see if there was ever a library set up, and you might know this, in Fayette County or in Haywood County in Tennessee. So I'll have to do some research on that. But the main question that I wanted to ask was, what's behind the whole sense of restricting literacy? We are seeing that now, so this is nothing new. We're seeing it, and particularly with the 1619 project. So what are your thoughts about restricting literacy?
White supremacy is the only reason for restricting literacy, especially to the African Americans. Like I said, did you think of anything crueler is to not give people access to schools, any sort of literacy, ban them from libraries, and then demand they take a test to be able to vote. It's horrible. We all know how horrible it is. But that's the only thing. And it's not just the violence of the segregated libraries. I found research in Mississippi, the people who ran the schools in that, they would choose which books to come in to schools. And the World Book Encyclopedia, they took, it's not surprising that books are banned all the time, they took issue with, because the R thing for race, it said some scientists have written that there were, there's no such thing as differences between the races. People have different color, different levels of melanin in their skin. So in Mississippi, this was taken issue with. So they sort of rewrote their own R book for the World Book Encyclopedia. It's something like that. If you could write an essay on how much better white society is compared to African American culture, you could get scholarships. You could have sort of, it's stuff like that. It's just from every angle to strip dignity from people. And that's today is the same thing. Whatever people are calling it, it's just racial hatred. And it's not just the United States. We up here in Canada, we're no different.
Mm-hmm. What was it that sparked your interest in this topic and looking at the work that was done during Freedom Summer and Freedom Libraries?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in the civil rights movement. And I went to library school in University of Alabama, which everyone knows at the schoolhouse, George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse to deny.
That's another story.
Yes. So I went there, I asked, where was that? Where did that take place? And so it's in this auditorium, and it was super hot, and I was running to see this place. And there it was, Foster Auditorium. And there's nothing about George Wallace, but the two students that he blocked from getting in, there's statues of them and plaques, and you could read about their lives and what they went on to do. And it was just, I thought, wow. And then I was reading about segregated libraries for one course, and I came across one sentence that said, freedom libraries were set up during Freedom Summer. So that got me, what's that? And no one seemed to know, and I couldn't find, but I found someone who had written a graduate thesis on it, sort of in the early 80s, had just mentioned, and a few in Mississippi had talked to somebody. So I got a hold of that, and then I thought, was there any in Alabama? Because it seemed that there wasn't, but it also seemed to me Alabama, there was a lot of ground zero for the civil rights. And so I was able to find two, just looking and researching, and so I wrote like a mini thesis on freedom libraries for my graduate degree. And I was asked to write a chapter about, a professor said, this company's doing a textbook on the history of American libraries. Can you write the chapter during the 60s? So I wrote the chapter about the public library movement and the freedom libraries in the 60s. I sent that, and then Chief Schematt said, sorry, they hate it. They don't want it in their textbook. So I was like, okay, ouch. But the editor of that textbook contacted me later and said, do you have a whole book about this? Do you think? I would like to publish a book. This is like the most fascinating thing I've never heard of. So that got me to research them more. And I was able to, like I said, I found 80 ones, Mississippi and Alabama and Arkansas, and one in Philadelphia, and got to talk and interview, thank God for the internet and phones. A lot of people are in their 90s now, and through their families and that. And it was such a life-changing experience to hear these stories about what people went through, just to help other people, give them a chance to read. And so that's where you find me here today talking about it.
Mike, I'd follow up there with just a question myself. I'm going to put on my archivist hat, and I understand that doing interviews with people is one thing, and exchanging email questionnaires and things. How did you actually find out about these 80? I mean, is there a book somewhere, a listing in the secret archives of the American South that says list of freedom libraries?
No, there isn't. I wish it was that easy. There isn't. There was an organization called Veterans of the Civil Rights Movement. And they had a website, and they had contact emails to help kids with their high school homework and that. And so I went through, told them who I was, what I was looking, do you know anything? And it was sort of by attrition by that. Oh, no, but somebody might, and get put in touch with. And so it took about, a few years just to get everything together from everybody. But it started, they were the nicest, most helpful people. The one in Haynesville, Alabama, because I was there, I went to this home and I knocked on their door on a Sunday, and this family, what? They're like, yes, our mom ran it, and this lady had a few strokes and was in her 90s, but they invited me in for dinner, and I met their whole family, and it was the most incredible. And I have to tell you, my experience in Alabama, you can't picture this stuff happening there. It's so beautiful. It's got to be one of the most nicest places I've ever seen. The people are so friendly and nice. It seems like, oh, this is like another planet, that this horrific violence is visited on these people. That's just, sorry, I got off topic. I started talking, but yeah, that's how I found, just kind of being a journalist or detective, just trying to get through what's the story, who knows.
And there was another question that popped up in our Q&A box. And the question is, do you actually list the 80 libraries that you discovered in the book? And were any of those that you found at that time in your research in either Tennessee or Kentucky?
No, I couldn't find any, none in Tennessee or Kentucky. That doesn't mean there wasn't any. No one kept any records, or no one knew anybody that had ran one. I was only told they're in Mississippi for the longest time. And then I found the ones in Alabama, and then Arkansas, and then Philadelphia. So it very could well be something, they might have called it something different too.
And if someone was interested in pursuing that, what would you recommend to a person living in West Tennessee or in Kentucky or anywhere else for that matter? What's the kind of approach that a researcher might take to figure out if these things happen in their town?
Yeah, I would research any civil rights activity that took place in your hometown or wherever you are. Try to find the people behind that, and then try to, if someone had mentioned libraries or books or literacy somewhere, and go from there. Just, keep bugging people and bugging people. But that's the best thing to start, is what happened here during the civil rights movement. Is there anyone around that knows? In Macomb, it was one lady had kept everything. She had been a student that used the Freedom Library there, but had kept everything from the civil rights, all the newspaper things, and made like a museum in her home, which her kids didn't care about and her grandkids didn't care about, and no one was really interested. And a fox or something got stuck, and the firemen had to come, and the local news come to say the fox was stuck in the roof. And then the news lady said, what's the shrine you have? And it kind of blew open the whole story there, that she had all these things, that there was a Freedom Library there. And so I was able to get in touch with the news people of that, and they put me in touch with the woman who actually had gone to Macomb and had all this stuff. And she was able to share photos with me and stories. And it's a fluke kind of thing, you'll trip over it.
Great. Well, I think we have exhausted all of the questions that had come in from our viewers. We've had a really nice audience who's been very interactive. So I'm going to turn things back over to Anthony, but I want to thank you again, Mike. It's such a pleasure always to hear you speak. It's a fascinating book, and just very impressive what you've done, and well-deserved accolades for the work.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for listening to me drone on. I'm glad. I hope people get something out of it. And
Mr. Selby, it was definitely an awesome presentation. And again, just echoing Dr. Norberg, we definitely appreciate you taking your time. We also want to thank Dr. Norberg and the Paul Meek Library for sponsoring this event tonight. And also want to remind everybody who may be interested in purchasing a copy of Mr. Selby's book. We will have some on hand tomorrow with our speaker, Hannibal Johnson. But the Barnes and Noble's bookstore will be selling. We'll have copies of the book for sale. And then, of course, you can find his book also online. I found my copy on Amazon. And also want to remind everybody of the other Freedom Summer, the photography of Nick Lawrence, the exhibit in the J. Houston Gordon Museum in the Paul Meek Library is running now until April 29th, Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. until 4:30 p.m. We have still a lot of events for the rest of the month. If you are interested in learning what events we have coming up, please visit our website at www.utm.edu/civil rights. There you will find a schedule of events. For our events that are virtual, you will find the links that you can register to, and also the YouTube streaming link for some of our speakers. Want to also remind everyone that tomorrow we will have Mr. Hannibal Johnson at 6:00 p.m. in the Watkins Auditorium, and he will be talking about Black Wall Street Remembered, and then pointing out a couple of other things. We will have a free health fair that is open to anyone, and that will be on February the 25th from 10 o'clock a.m. until 3 o'clock p.m. in the University Center Ballroom. We want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Again, please, for more information about the Civil Rights Conference, please feel free to reach out to the co-chairs, Dr. Lindsay Anderson, Henrietta Giles, or myself, Anthony Pruitt, and we will answer you all. Again, thank you, Mr. Selby. We appreciate you and the work that you've done. Thank you again to the Paul Meek Library, and everyone have an awesome night.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike. Be well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you take care, guy.
Thank you.